Okay, let's jump into our next lecture on the hard problem of consciousness. Our reading for this one was Chalmers. So today we're going to be discussing a little bit about the subjective character of experience, that phenomenology that we talked about in the last lecture from Nagel. And what we're interested in is the relationship between brain science and mechanical reasoning about the brain and its relationship to phenomenology, which gives us what Chalmers calls the hard problem. So this is to be contrasted with easy problems. So we can and do learn about brain function, and other features of behavior and action that follows from the way that the brain works. And Chalmers calls these problems easy, like for instance how we discriminate perceptual stimuli. How does the perceptual system work in order to tell the difference between red and blue, or this object and that object? How do we integrate information from distinct sensory modalities with other cognitive information? So, for instance, how do I know that the object I'm looking at is both a sphere, and so I would hold it something like this, that it has particular colors and shapes that I might be able to touch with my hand, and that I understand that it is a globe, so it's a map of the Earth, right? These are multimodal and cognitive pieces of information that are bound together in the same object, which is the globe. Likewise, how do we manage to verbally express internal states? So I feel hunger, and so I say I'm hungry. These are easy problems in as much as we can map out the way that the mind, the brain, and the body all work together to generate these kinds of stimuli, responses, behaviors, etc. Behavioral and brain sciences have made great progress with these kinds of questions and will likely and ultimately answer them completely. We'll eventually get to a point where we understand completely how the perceptual system functions. So, as Chalmers says, the hard problem, in contrast, is the question of how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience, that phenomenological character, that quality of experience. This puzzle, Chalmers says, involves the inner aspect of thought and perception, the way that things feel for the subject. When we see, for example, we experience visual sensations, such as that of a vivid blue, or think of an ineffable sound of a distant oboe, the agony of an intense pain, the sparkle of happiness, or the meditative quality of a moment lost in thought. All are a part of what I'm calling consciousness. It is these phenomena that pose the real mystery of the mind. And this is the same worry shared by Nagel in What It's Like to Be a Bat. How can an objective, purely physicalist description capture phenomenal consciousness? Or how can it be that such a physicalist description can explain subjective qualitative experience? Chalmers calls this the hard problem of consciousness, which is hard because it looks like whatever we use as a physicalist description to describe physical things works, but physical things are objective things. The subjective character of experience is not a perfectly objective thing, particularly because it's something that's had by me or had by you. It's subjective. So Chalmers raises this hard problem of consciousness in saying that that part of the conscious experience, the character of it, the subjective personal character of it, can't be described in terms of physicalist descriptions like we can describe how the perceptual system works or how the rest of the brain functions. So what are we to do? Well, we can explain the mind along two extremes. We can be perfectly reductionist. We can be behaviorists or identity theorists. And we can also be what Chalmers calls Mysterianism, which is like Descartes' substance dualism. Some people think that the hard problem of consciousness isn't actually so hard, that it's really an easier problem. And so they reduce consciousness to brain states. And this would be like a complete kind of reductionism. Mysterianism, on the other hand, completely carves out the subjective character of experience as a unique sort of thing, a new kind of thing from physical substance. And this is mysterious because if it's not a physical kind of thing, then what is it? Chalmers wants to find a middle ground between these two kinds of views. So here's another reason to motivate the hardness of the hard problem of consciousness. Chalmers recalls a thought experiment from Jackson's famous paper in 1982 that has us imagine Mary, who is an uber scientist in the future. She's a physicist, a neuroscientist, a biologist. She knows everything about everything. And she's lived and worked, she's grown up hold on, I'm sneezing. She's lived and worked her entire life in a black and white room. Mary knows all the physical facts that there are to know about the human brain and the nervous system, being the super uber scientist that she is. And this includes all of the facts about the human sensory systems. Importantly, Mary also knows how color names respond to wavelengths on a spectrum and how human color vision functions. So let's suppose Mary, for the first time, exits the black and white room and goes out into the big wide world. Would she learn anything new? So she stepped outside of her black and white room and say she looks at a tomato. Chalmers says, yes, of course, she learns what it's like to experience red. So she understands that redness is a certain kind of frequency or wavelength of light that hits the eyes, that is transmitted into the brain by electrical signals that then represent and process through the brain as whatever red is supposed to be in her black and white room. But when she walks out of the room and sees the tomato for the first time, all of a sudden she doesn't just know that there is a frequency, she knows what it's like to have the experience of the redness of the tomato. So Mary would learn what it's like to have a qualitative subjective experience of colors. And this knowledge would be new knowledge, in spite of Mary's exhaustive knowledge of the physical facts. Remember, Mary knows everything about the physical world, and she learns something new about the experience or the character of the physical fact of red. So here's an argument. 1. If physical science can give a full explanation of the world, then Mary knows all there is to know and would learn nothing upon exiting the black and white room. 2. Mary learns something when she exits the black and white room. Therefore, physical science cannot give a full explanation of the world. But what's left out? What's the difference between the full set of physical facts that Mary knows and her new knowledge that she gets after leaving the black and white room? Well, it turns out that it's facts about phenomenal conscious experience, which brings us right back to the hard problem of consciousness, which is to explain the phenomenal subjective character of consciousness, the what it's like to us to have an experience as we do, which suggests that science is not up to the task. So these considerations suggest that there's an explanatory gap between the qualitative conscious experience that everyone has in their everyday lives and the physical processes that underlie those conscious experiences, and likewise how science understands them. We seem to have no obvious conceptual means for addressing the hard problem. Why or how do physical processes in the brain or wherever give rise to phenomenally conscious experiences? So we might ask, how does such and such brain state result in qualitative experiences of the sort correlated with it? How is the brain having these particular kinds of neurological operations correlate to this kind of qualitative subjective experience? Or why does a state playing a certain functional role in an experience of the sort that it does? Thus, the hard problem sits on the other side of this explanatory gap. It doesn't seem that we can say why we have this kind of character of experience on the basis of that particular physical state of the brain. So, Chalmers' response to this in the paper is a first suggestion of a solution to this problem. So he looks back at the way that science has been done historically, and he says, look, science posits certain fundamental entities which are irreducible or not explained by lower level entities, things like mass and charge and spacetime. So for example, before electromagnetism was discovered, we thought that mechanical science was able to explain everything. But then electromagnetism is discovered, and it turns out the laws and rules of mechanical science don't apply to electromagnetism. So what we do is we posit electromagnetic forces as an irreducible primitive or a basic sort of entity, and then we generate rules and principles for how this irreducible primitive entity, like charge, operates with the world and interacts with other irreducible primitive entities like mass or like spacetime. Spacetime being an even more recent development of a primitive entity from our 20th century science. So Chalmers argues that existing fundamental laws and concepts, which work for every other form of scientific discovery that we've made through history, fail to address the hard problem of consciousness. So he says, if the existence of consciousness cannot be derived from physical laws, a theory of physics is not a true theory of everything. So a final theory must contain some additional fundamental component. And toward this end, I propose that conscious experience be considered a fundamental feature, irreducible to anything more basic. So Chalmers is saying here that, like electromagnetism in light of mechanical science was unexplainable, consciousness in light of any theory of physics is unexplainable, and so we should posit it as a primitive fundamental basic and then come up with laws or rules for how it works. So here's the argument. If some phenomenon X cannot be explained by the principles and laws of scientific theory in general, then X is a fundamental entity. And scientific theories, as it turns out, given the hard problem of consciousness, cannot explain consciousness. So conscious properties, says Chalmers, or suggests Chalmers, at least in this paper, are fundamental properties. So supposing that we grant this conclusion, then Chalmers suggests that we must proceed by identifying what he calls psychophysical bridge laws. These are like the laws that explain how electromagnetism interacts with physical objects. Similarly, these are the sorts of laws that would be those of how consciousness, or the subjective phenomenal character of experience, interacts with brain states, or laws that somehow bridge the non-reducible mental properties to ordinary physical properties of the world. But what would such psychophysical laws involve? Chalmers offers another suggestion. He says that the relevant laws will probably involve the concept of information, that there are information-carrying states that physical entities can have. So, for instance, a thermometer tells us the temperature, or a brain state or C fiber activation in a human indicates contains the information of pain. Understood abstractly, information involves a set of discrete states structured by similarities and differences between the states. So normally we think of information as embodied or as carried by some physical object or event, like words or pictures or maps or measuring devices, animal tracks, or brain states. But we also, perhaps most obviously, think of information as carried by conscious mental states. So what would such psychophysical laws involve? Well, intriguingly, says Chalmers, it turns out that we find the same information states embedded in conscious experience and in underlying physical processes in the brain. The three-dimensional encoding of color spaces, for example, suggests that the information state in a color experience corresponds directly to an information state in the brain. So we might even regard the two states as distinct aspects of the same information state. What's going on in the brain and what's represented in the character of experience are just different aspects of the same state of information, which is simultaneously embodied in both the physical processing and conscious experience. So this is to say that information may have dual aspects, which one is physical and the other is experiential. And so the psychophysical bridge law should somehow explain how the information that is carried by the brain and represented by consciousness shares this dual aspect, same referent or item of information sort of character. And this would not solve the hard problem of consciousness, but it would bridge the explanatory gap between that qualitative character of conscious experience that seems unable to be explained by physical processes and that relationship that, of course, the subjective character of consciousness has to the physical processes.